Chapter 7: The Southwest Corridor. Following the transition from the Type 11s to the Type 12s, the Orange Line had become a lot more comfortable and reliable with its new fleet of cars and passenger service. Now, you might be thinking that the Orange Line was done making major changes for the time being, but something big was on the horizon for the Orange Line that would change the entire identity of the line as a whole. That change would be the move from the elevated to the Southwest Corridor. From the 1960s all the way until 1978, the state of Massachusetts was planning on extending I-95 to meet up with Route 128 and connect the various neighborhoods in between with the main city. From 1966 to 1976, over 1,000 residential and business buildings were demolished to clear land for where the highway would be built. During this time, the public was not happy that a highway was being built through what was once a thriving neighborhood. The protest movement, Stop I-95, People Before Highways, was established, with the residents of Jamaica Plain, Roxbury, and the South End fiercely opposing the Southwest Expressway project. By 1978, there was enough pressure from the public that the state of Massachusetts abandoned the Southwest Expressway project and handed it off to another bidder. The bidder who would eventually take control of the project would be the MBTA. For some context, throughout the 1970s and 1980s, residents who lived right next to the elevated Orange Line along Washington Street began to complain about the elevated. Common complaints were the loud screeching from the trains passing by, the dilapidated infrastructure that was falling apart, as well as the effect that it had on property value within the area. Alongside these complaints, the MBTA examined the Washington Street elevated and made a concerning discovery. They had discovered that the structural integrity of the elevated had deteriorated extensively throughout the previous decade, and if they were to keep the line in its current elevated state, all of the existing elevated structures would have to be demolished and completely rebuilt if they were to keep the line in its elevated state. Of course, this option would not be the best, since if they were to rebuild the L to address the structural problems, it would mean they would have to shut down service on the entire south side of the Orange Line for potentially years to make the replacements. Given these two predicaments, the MBTA began planning to relocate the Orange Line to somewhere more suitable for the long term. Originally, the MBTA was planning to relocate the Orange Line to the median of the proposed Southwest Expressway. Unfortunately, the I-95 project fell through, and the MBTA had to figure out what to do with the Orange Line. Fortunately, the state of Massachusetts was looking for another builder/contractor to take up the abandoned project and use the space that had been cleared. The MBTA saw the opportunity and won the bid to fill the construction project. With the MBTA now in control of the abandoned Southwest Expressway project, the Southwest Corridor project was announced. The Southwest Corridor called for a central rail line that would be used by the commuter rail and Amtrak to connect Boston's South Station Terminal to Route 128 and the Northeast Corridor that was owned by Amtrak. Alongside this, a 4-mile stretch from the south end of Boston to Forest Hills and Jamaica Plain would be used by the Orange Line. The public approved of this proposed project, and construction of the Southwest Corridor began in 1979. By February of 1987, the Southwest Corridor was nearing completion with an anticipated opening date of May 4, 1987. With the opening date looming near, the MBTA began making preparations to begin service on the Southwest Corridor, loading 4 cars of the Type 12s onto flatbed trucks and transporting them to the newly built Forest Hills layover yard. Throughout the last few months of the Southwest Corridor construction, the MBTA rigorously tested the 4 Type 12s on the new line, ironing out all the kinks and power problems so that they could begin revenue service with no issues. On April 15, 1987, the MBTA announced that the Washington Street portion of the Orange Line would shut down for a period of 4 days so that they could move all of their remaining equipment from the elevated to the Southwest Corridor. During these last few days of the elevated and revenue operation, residents who lived next to the Washington Street elevated were photographing, videoing, and experiencing the elevated while it was still around. For some context, the MBTA's Orange Line, or formerly the Boston Elevated Railway, Mainline Elevated, was one of the first elevated electrified rapid transit systems in U.S. history. With the end growing near for the elevated, residents took up the opportunity to preserve what they saw as a critical part of Boston's history. Given this major transition and historical significance, the MBTA decided to do something special on the last night of the Washington Street Elevated in operation. On April 30th, 1987, the MBTA ran one last non-revenue train along the Washington Street Elevated as a farewell voyage before the L would be closed down and demolished. The MBTA chose cars 1243, 1242, 1309, and 1308 for the final voyage event. People who attended the event brought champagne, video recorders, and cameras and celebrated the end of the very first elevated rapid transit systems in Boston and U.S. history. And the Type 12s would go down in history as the last train cars to run on the first elevated transit system in all of U.S. history. Finally, on May 4th, 1987, at 5:05 a.m., cars 1201, 1200, 1248, and 1249 took their inaugural trip down the newly opened Southwest Corridor.
Good morning, Orange Line riders. It's the first revenue trip from Forest Hill Station to Oak Grove Station. It's a pleasure to have you all aboard today. Please sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride.